watching Clear Cut, coming to you live from New York City. Welcome back. I'm Michelle McQuarrie, and we have been discussing the Middle East Security Summit that wrapped up today. U.S. Vice President Mike Pence making a strong declaration imploring America's European allies to withdraw from the Iran nuclear deal and confront the Iranian regime. Pence took particular aim at a new European financial system that helps companies skirt U.S. sanctions on Iran.
Sadly, some of our leading European partners have not been nearly as cooperative. In fact, they've led the effort to create mechanisms to break up our sanctions. The United States, Israel, and nations across the Middle East and around the world. They call this scheme a special purpose vehicle. We call it an effort to break American sanctions against Iran's murderous revolutionary regime. It's an ill-advised step that will only strengthen Iran, weaken the EU, and create still more distance between Europe and the United States.
All right, to discuss, let's bring in my panel. Joining me is Iman, the chairman of the board and executive director of the New Iran, and Greg Roman, the director of the Middle East Forum, here in studio with me. Greg, thanks. Let's start off with you, Greg. U.S. Vice President Pence, as we heard there, calling on European countries to withdraw from the Iran nuclear deal. Do you get a sense, perhaps, that the U.S. is causing some division amongst European countries? There are some that have become increasingly frustrated with Iran's destabilizing activities in the region. As we mentioned earlier, some successful, some attempted assassination attempts on European soil. And of course, it's a violation of the UN resolution by continuing to test its ballistic missiles. Do you think that there could be a split forming here?
We could take a menu of all the Iranian malign activities that have been taking place in Europe and also beyond Europe that have been affecting European interests, put them on a table of the foreign ministers of that country, of that continent, and they would be able to pick from a whole milieu of things that would be affecting them. And I think that right now what you see is the Czech Republic, Slovakia, other Eastern European countries, which are getting closer to Trump politically, are starting to feel the pressure from statements like Vice President Pence and even that of the Polish foreign minister, who was a little bit hesitant in hosting the conference in his own country, but has been finding that there's a division now in the European Union, and the more that that's likely to succeed in terms of convincing more European countries to go in the way of the president, it'll be harder for Germany, France, and the UK to use a special purpose vehicle to help skirt the Iran sanctions, which are now facing down on that country.
Greg, staying with you, what is it going to take for those European countries to make that move and effectively go in a different direction?
I hope it doesn't get to this point, but it's going to be the United States telling Europe, you either trade with us or you trade with Iran. And when you look at the size of the economies of scale, the U.S. is something like 400 times the size of the Iranian economy. It's an easy choice to be able to make that, but Pence wants to give them some time before they have to get to that point.
Iman, the president pulled out of the deal because he says it has major flaws. The restrictions on inspections, the sunset clause, for example, at best just delays Iran's nuclear program. In fact, puts Iran in a better position to pursue nuclear weapons when the deal expires, and that's in just like less than a decade. And the deal doesn't address, as we mentioned, the ballistic missile program or Iran's aggression in the region. But Iman, some argue that a flawed deal is better than no deal, and that the sanctions only serve to hurt ordinary Iranians and will have no impact on the mullahs of Tehran. What do you say to that?
Well, we certainly are with Vice President Pence and the status that the United States and its allies have taken, excluding the European unions, because those of us who are very familiar with this regime, and we talk to the Iranian people basically on a daily basis, hour by hour throughout Iran, we know that this regime has long-term ambitions for basically exporting Islam throughout the world, and that's why they're having all these terrorist activities throughout the world. And we do not believe that only focusing on the nuclear agreement, especially the one that has all these flaws and basically has a sunset clause now, less than 8 years or so, is going to be sufficient. As your other guest mentioned, Islamic Republic has been violating the United Nations Resolution 2231 regarding missiles for a long time. And the other thing is that even with this trading platform that some European companies are trying to put together, at the end of the day, it's the European companies that are responsible to their stakeholders and shareholders to have to make a decision. And with the vast majority of them, almost all of them have pulled out from trading with Iran because they already have a choice to either trade with the United States or Islamic Republic, and sooner than later, the rest of the European countries, perhaps, hopefully not, but maybe that if a terrorism activity happens in their soils without them being able to, prohibit those and prevent those, then that may be the breaking point. But we see this, what the Europe is doing is only elongating the eventual outcome of this, and that is basically forcing either the regime to change its behavior, which we don't think they will, and therefore somehow supporting the Iranian people to topple this regime themselves.
Dr. Foroughian, you have said that your sources on the ground tell you that the government in Tehran has never been closer to collapse. Is that because of the sanctions?
The sanctions have certainly had an impact last few months. As you know, JPOA was disbanded by the United States about 6 months ago. But it's really the fact that the Islamic regime does not and has not had the proper management team for 40 years to take care of the economy of Iran. So most of what's happening in Iran, whether it's a bad air or shortage of water or everything else that is going on, the young people don't having any jobs and prostitution and drugs and everything, these have nothing to do with the sanctions that were enacted 6 months ago, but these are the results of 40 years of bad management of the company and corruption and stealing the oil money and all the wealth that the Iranian people have, and people like Khamenei and his surrounding people basically pocketing those for themselves, either inside Iran or in foreign countries' bank accounts.
Greg, the Trump administration denies or doesn't explicitly state that the goal is regime change. We did hear, though, from Rudy Giuliani, who is, of course, the president's personal lawyer, so not a real representative of the Trump administration in this regard, calling for regime change, as he was at one of the opposition rallies at the conference yesterday. Should the U.S. be doing more to support that goal somehow?
I think that soft regime change, not hard regime change, as in trying to apply external pressures to create internal dissent, just like the previous guest had mentioned, is probably the best policy to have that go through. But the idea that the Iranian government doesn't have a stranglehold on every single population center in their country through the besieged, the irregular militia, or through the IRGC is somewhat of a naive notion, just due to the fact that they control every aspect of Iranian life. And while they may not be able to control some of the areas which are minoritarian controlled, at the same time, the U.S. has to be able to split Tehran, the capital itself, and start causing fissures between the mullahs, the army, and the centers of economic power. And if they don't have a more advanced strategy to be able to do that by doing activities in country, I think the problem is going to continue to get worse, and you may see war between Iran and its neighbors. And that's not a situation I think anyone wants to get to.
So, Iman, what can be done to further facilitate the opposition within Iran?
Well, that's a great question. Actually, one of the outcomes of last year's uprising of the Iranian people inside Iran, and certainly United States support for the people of Iran, has actually resulted in a number of opposition groups, including the New Iran that I represent, to work together. We jointly with 11 other organizations that perhaps haven't talked or worked together or cooperated together for the last 40 years. For the last few weeks, weeks we worked together. We have sent out 2 letters. The first one to the host of the Warsaw conference, Mr. Pompeo, and the Poland foreign minister, and another letter yesterday specifically asking and demanding items that we hear from the Iranian people. Those include that basically having further sanctions against the IRGC and the Revolutionary Guard, providing free internet access to the Iranian people so they can do their communications with the outside world better, to further restricting the Iranian representatives to international communities and international conferences and others, and actually expelling a lot of the agents inside different countries outside Iran.
Right. Greg, I want to focus on the Israeli aspect of this. Of course, it relates to everything, but there seemed to be a major breakthrough, at least the way Prime Minister Netanyahu hailed it, where he says that at least 4 foreign ministers of Arab countries did make it clear to him that they support Israel's right to defend itself against Iranian aggression. And the mere fact that you had an Israeli Prime Minister at a conference with 10 other Arab leaders is quite significant.
We haven't seen that in 30 years since the Madrid conference. The Bahraini, the Omani, the Emirati, and the Saudi foreign ministers on video, which was leaked earlier today from the Prime Minister's office, all gave a certain amount of inclination that they support Israel's position in the region vis-a-vis Iran and also vis-a-vis the Palestinians. So you have 2 major regional issues in which the Arab foreign leaders are coming down on Israel's side. And even going beyond that, there was an interview that took place last night with Barak Ravid on Israel's Channel 13, where the former intelligence minister and ambassador to the United States from Saudi Arabia, Turki bin al-Faisal, said he understands Israel's position vis-a-vis Iran, and it's not because of Israel's unique security concerns. It's because Saudi Arabia has been facing Iranian intransigence for the last 40 years as well. So they have greater existential threats, which are bringing them together, and the Prime Minister was correct to show up at that meeting with these other Arab foreign leaders to make sure that they're speaking with one voice regarding the Iran issue, and I see that leading into a détente in their relations.
Greg, is the common enemy of Iran, though, enough to bring about semi-formal ties between Israel and these other countries without having the Palestinian issue solved first?
Well, if you actually point to a May 25th, 2017 article that came out in Yisrael Hayom, an Israeli newspaper, it said that the Trump administration's position was first to have closer relations between Arab countries and Israel and leave the Palestinian issue to a later date. And that's what's happening now. You have the Saudis hosting Trump and him discussing Israel there. You have meetings at the UN with Israel. You have the Israeli ministers and prime minister visiting Arab countries in the Gulf. So it's not like we're having this hypothesis or theory behind it. It's actually happening before our eyes.
But there was a report in an Israeli media organization where it said that the Saudis claim that Netanyahu is, well, delusional if he thinks that there can be relations with them without having sorted the Palestinian issue. Are they just paying lip service?
Yeah, this was a bunch of bureaucrats in the Israeli Foreign Ministry's Amram division, which is their research division, which has traditionally taken a more conservative notion toward the way that Israel conducts its foreign policy. But if you look at what's happening on the ground, the intelligence services cooperating, cultural, sports, educational initiatives, the day-by-day progress we're seeing between the Israeli leadership and Arab leadership is evidence of a thaw in relations.
Iman, very quickly, what do you think this conference has accomplished?
The major points is that for the first time, over 60 countries came together to talk about Middle East security, but they...
All right, we seem to have lost Dr. Forotan there. But Greg, overall, would you consider this conference to be a success?
It's a great success, and I hope that it continues under this leadership of this administration, under the aegis of a new promise between Arab and Israeli between the Arab countries and Israel under Trump's leadership and potentially future American leaders.
All right, Greg Roman, Director of the Middle East Forum, thank you so much, and our thanks again to Dr. Iman Forotan. All right, keep it right here.